So welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to have you here with us for the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. We are in chapter 4 at this point, called The First Solution, Expulsion. So, a few things to say. Chapters 1 through 3, which we've read together, are really looking at this question of, well, who is this man, Adolf Eichmann? So, the second chapter is called The Accused, and it's about Eichmann and who he is. The third chapter, which we read last week, was an expert on the Jewish question. And I said that there was at least in the second part of it, really was one of the key theses of the book, which is that that the decisive character flaw in Eichmann was what she calls on page 47 to 48 his almost total inability ever to look at anything from the other fellow's point of view. And this is in the chapter on the expert on the Jewish question, because she's saying that he's not an ordinary criminal, right? He became an expert. He thought he was an expert. And he thought he was working for something, like an idealist. And he found himself thinking that he had something in common with other idealists, like other Zionists, and that he was working towards a common goal with them. And this is really, in many ways, both the crux of Arendt's argument and also, I think, a lot of the reason for the controversy around the book. How do we make sense of this claim of hers that Eichmann was ludicrous, that he was a clown, because she calls him a clown in this chapter, in chapter 3. And she says he's ludicrous. And in chapter 4, which we read for today, she calls it grotesque. So how do we make sense of this claim that she thinks he's grotesque and ludicrous and a clown, and yet she wants to say we have to take seriously that he's not an ordinary criminal, that he wasn't necessarily lying when he says things like, well, I was trying to work with the Jews and the Zionists, and I thought we were on the same page. Now, on the one hand, it's grotesque, right? I mean, obviously, a Nazi who's helping Jews to get out of Germany by stripping them of their money and forcing them out is not the same as a Zionist who's trying to get the Jews out, right? There's a grotesque stupidity, okay, banality, to such an idea. And yet, she says it doesn't mean he's lying. And we have to take those two things seriously enough that we try and think them together, right? And what does that mean? And that's what starts to happen here in chapter 4. So chapter 4, it begins the second part of the book, right? The first part of the book is these 3 beginning chapters looking at who Eichmann is, right? And it's very psychological and very an attempt, and very much based on the facts of his life. Chapter 4 is quite different. It starts a series of chapters. It's called The First Solution, Expulsion. Chapter 5, which we'll read in 2 weeks, is called The Second Solution, Concentration. And chapter 6 is called The Final Solution, Killing. Those are going to be 3 chapters that are much more historical, and not necessarily only about Eichmann, but Arendt is now looking at the Nazi period, and looking at the way the Nazis addressed the Jewish question. But it's important that she divides these into 3 chapters because they're very different, right? The first solution that the Nazis came up to the Jewish problem was expulsion. The second was concentration, and the third was killing. Now, for a lot of us, right, the Nazis represent the Holocaust represents mass bureaucratic killing, and that's not wrong. But what Arendt is going to remind us is that mass bureaucratic killing doesn't begin until 1940 or 41. That means that the first 7.5 to 8 years that Eichmann is working for the Nazis, there's no policy of killing. The policy is first expulsion, and secondly, concentration. And so most of Eichmann's career is not involved in a Holocaust. It's involved in expulsion and then concentration. Does this matter? Right? On one level, no, right? I mean, all of these things are sort of wrong. Are wrong, not sort of wrong, are wrong. All of these things are fundamentally based in anti-Semitism and fundamentally based in not only potentially a dislike or hatred of Jews, although that's not always the case, but is certainly based on an ideological claim and argument that the Jews are parasites, Jews are less than human, that Jews are destroying German society, and that in order to save German society, we need to deal with the Jewish problem, which means getting rid of them, putting them somewhere else, or killing them. So they all go together. And yet, it's also the case that there are moral gradations to be made. And I know people don't like to sometimes think that way. But Arendt is going to ask us to, and to look at the differences and look at and the way that it may be one thing to be a bureaucrat working for the Nazis when the policy is expulsion, and maybe something very different to work for the Nazis when the policy is killing. We need to at least understand her attempts to make these distinctions, and then we can ask ourselves whether we think these distinctions are worth making and important and valid or not. In any case, as we get into chapter 4 on expulsion, she starts it off in a very, I think, provocative way. She says, had this been an ordinary trial, right? We would expect Eichmann to make a defense and his defense team to make a defense. And she says they didn't. They never really sought to defend themselves in any way. He admitted he had done it, right? She says, look, I mean, let's be honest. The facts here were never in dispute. He worked for the Nazis. His job was to expel, concentrate, and then transport Jews to be killed at the end. No one disputed these facts. He didn't dispute these facts. He admitted them. There wasn't much to really do at the trial if that was all there was. But she says Eichmann did say something which could have been a defense, and his defense lawyer never pursued it. And she says, okay, I'm going to pursue it. Now, this is, of course, controversial. Here is Hannah Arendt, a Jewish survivor, sitting at the trial saying, let's try and offer a defense for Eichmann. And this is not, again, to say he's not guilty. She thinks he's guilty. She thinks he should be killed. But she's like, if we want to understand Eichmann, we have to understand how he understood what he was doing. Okay, what was his defense? Because he admitted he did it. He said, you should kill me. Remember, he says, honestly, I was wrong, and you should hang me in front of, in the public square as a warning to all people who are anti-Semites. That's what he says, at the trial. Um, but what was his defense? And she says, um, she says that Eichmann gave what she calls on page 56 a grotesque account of his activities in Vienna, right? Okay. How is a grotesque account a defense? Um, well, she says, could it be, she asks this question, could it be, this is again on 56, that Eichmann's distortions of reality could not really be ascribed to more than the mendacity of an individual? What does she mean by that? She means, could it be that this grotesque account, that his grotesqueness, that his distortions of reality, this crazy idea he had that he was sort of a Zionist, that he was helping the Jews, could this be not just his own lying, his own mendacity, but something bigger, right? Um, and she says, in order to answer that, we have to go deeply into what she calls, again on page 56, Eichmann's muddled general outlook and ideology with respect to the Jewish question. All right, well, what is Eichmann's muddled ideology with respect to the Jewish question? I'm going to do something I don't always do, which is read a longer quote, which is on page 57. But on page 57, he said that he regarded the Jews as opponents with respect to whom a mutually acceptable, a mutually fair solution had to be found. Right? It's an important line. They were opponents, but they were opponents that we had to find a mutually fair and mutually acceptable solution. And he continues, that solution I envisaged, this is Eichmann speaking, as putting firm soil under their feet so that they would have a place of their own, soil of their own. And I was working in the direction of that solution joyfully because it was the kind of solution that was approved by movements among the Jewish people themselves. He says on page 57 again that he and the Jews pulled together, right? And he says that he has helped save hundreds of thousands of Jews. And he says, look, some Jews disagreed with this, but a lot of the Jews, right, understood that leaving Germany was a good thing. And as he says, quote, one had to help them. One had to help these functionaries to act. And that's what I did. So this is the grotesque, muddled general outlook and ideology with respect to the Jewish question that she says Eichmann had. Now, you all know that she's been accused at times of saying Eichmann was a Zionist. That is not what she's saying, right? She says this is grotesque. This is ridiculous. But we have to see what's going on here. And she says that one reason that his defense team, namely his lawyer Servatius, did make this argument that what Eichmann was doing was deeper than Eichmann. It was not his personal idea, but was part of what she's going to call a systemic mendacity. Is that Eichmann himself admitted that he wasn't simply a cog. He doesn't want to make the argument that he was just part of a system, a cog, a small cog doing the thing. So in an interview he gave with a guy named Wilhelm Sassen, who was a Dutch Nazi journalist who then, after the war, ended up in Argentina along with many Nazis, including Eichmann. Eichmann gave an interview to Sassen, and he says that he did not greet his assignment with the apathy of an ox being led to a stall. Right? He says, I wasn't just a bureaucrat doing my job. I wasn't just a cog. I did my job well, and I used initiative, and I tried to do it as well as I could. He says, I read Herzl's Judenstaat. I was a believer, an idealist. There were other people who were just office drudges, but not me. And so, you know, Arendt never takes seriously the idea that Eichmann was just a small cog in a bureaucratic machine, just like he doesn't think he was a small cog in a bureaucratic machine. But, and here's the big but, she does take seriously that Eichmann's muddled, grotesque ideology was actually widely shared in Germany from 1933 till 1938 or 39, both by Nazis everywhere, but also by many Jews, right? That's going to be, this is a really controversial claim, right? So she first says that those who criticized Jews and others who went into exile, this is on page 58, um, those who criticized Jews and others who went into exile starting in Hannah Arendt went into exile, for example, in 1933, right? She's arrested in 1933. She was released, and boom, she ran right out of the country and went to Paris. Those who criticized people like her who went into exile, they said, "Oh, you abandoned us. You left us here in Germany to deal with things, and what could we do after you abandoned us?" And she says this is idiocy, right? These people forget what was actually happening in Germany, and they call the Hitler period barbarism, but they forget that they themselves abandoned the Jews, right? They didn't stand up for the Jews. So how can you blame the Jews for leaving and other people for leaving? So she says, okay, what was Eichmann's story? What was his real defense that he didn't make, but she thinks could be made for him? And her recreation of it is this: that during the first stages of Nazism, the Nazis the Nazis embarked on a pro-Zionist program. Now, this is a quote that she quotes, citing Hans Hom, who was a journalist and later president of the Israeli Cultural Foundation in Munich, in Bayern. And Hans Hom writes, that the Nazis in the 1930s were pro-Zionist. Arendt says that Eichmann was not alone amongst the Nazis in taking pro-Zionism seriously. And she says it wasn't only Nazis. On page 59, she says the Zionists also took advantage of the Hitler regime. She says that only the Zionists could negotiate with the Germans and the Nazis because the other Jewish groups saw the Nazis as anti-Semitic and couldn't negotiate with them. So she says during the first years of Hitler, the Zionists became part of the Zionists. It's not that they embraced Nazism. She's not saying that at all. What she's saying is that the Zionists thought they could use Nazism in an internecine battle with assimilationists, right? They thought that, okay, Nazism is bad. It's terrible, right? But we can use it to our advantage. She cites a letter from a survivor of Theresienstadt, who says that the Zionists supported many of the same positions as the Nazis, and that the Nazis saw Zionists as decent Jews since they too thought in national or ethnic terms, right? That's a Zionist, that's a Jewish survivor who's critiquing the Zionists and the Nazis. She says that there's a chavara, or a fellowship, that allowed the Nazis and the Zionists to create agreements, illegal agreements, secret agreements that would help transport Jews to Palestine. She says that when emissaries from Palestine approached the Gestapo and the SS to enlist help with illegal immigration, they were welcomed. That the Nazis helped Jews from Palestine, emissaries from Palestine, create training camps for young Jews who would become prospective immigrants. These Palestinian emissaries, Jewish Palestinian emissaries, then met with Eichmann in Vienna and reported that he was polite, not the shouting type, and he helped them. That their goal, the mutual goal, they said, was to select suitable material, to pick the young, strong Jewish pioneers and allow the Jews to do the selecting themselves to get them out of Germany and into Israel. She cites David Kimchi, who was a very fascinating man. I didn't know who he was until I looked it up. He's an Israeli diplomat. He became deputy director of Mossad and spy master. Apparently, he's the one who was the mutual contact between the United States and Iran during the Iran-Contra affair. And in 1955, David Kimchi wrote a book with his brother, John Kimchi, called The Secret Roads, The Illegal Migration of a People, 1938 to 1948, in which he writes, it was this fundamental, in which he writes that the Jews, the Nazis and the Palestinian Jews worked together to bring Jews out of Germany. And Arendt writes, it was this fundamental error in judgment that eventually led to a situation in which the non-selected majority of Jews inevitably found themselves confronted by two enemies, the Nazi authorities and the Jewish authorities. You can see the complicated argument and controversial argument she's making. On page I think on page 59, she talks about Robert Welch, who was the editor-in-chief of the Jüdische Rundschau, one of the main newspapers in Germany, Jewish newspapers in Germany. And Robert Welch, in 1933, coined the phrase, wear it with pride, der gelbe Blot, or der gelbe Fleck, right? The yellow dot, or the yellow blot, or the yellow star, depending on how you want to translate it. The idea was that Zionists in Germany, 6 years before the Nazis required Jews to wear a yellow star, right? 6 years before that, Zionists said to Jews in Germany, wear a yellow blot on yourself to identify yourself as Jewish, right? To not assimilate, to speak with a national pride. And Arendt is being super critical at this point. Well, I don't know if she's being, I think she is. Yeah, I think she's being super critical. We could discuss this. But what she's doing, whether she's criticizing or not, we can talk about that. But what she's doing is talking about how deeply many Zionists, for completely different reasons than the Nazis, out of a felt need, out of an emergency, out of all sorts of different reasons. There's no moral in any way moral kind of setting at the same level the Nazis and the Zionists. But there is, she says, a growing sense amongst many in Germany, both Nazis and Zionists, that the Jews should get out, that they should leave, that they should take a kind of nationalist, ethno-nationalist approach, and that they should go to Palestine. And Arendt, what she's saying is that this confluence of Nazi and Zionist agreement about the need to forcibly expel the Jews shows that what Eichmann was doing from 1933 to at least 1937, 38, not that it was right. What he was doing was using, was basically stealing money from Jews in order to get them out of the country, but that there was a way in which it was still part of a kind of again, she thinks it's grotesque, but he could imagine it as part of a kind of idealist endeavor. And she then quotes, she talks about 3 different Jewish leaders who Eichmann worked with, who shared this view. Now, again, these are all people forced to share this view, and yet they worked with him. So one is This is on page 63 to 64. Josef Leonherz, who wrote a memo after the war. He was the first Jewish functionary to organize a whole Jewish community into the service of the Nazi authorities. And he was rewarded by being allowed to stay and live in Vienna until the end of the war, when he emigrated to the UK and the USA. Right. This is a Jewish functionary who worked with Eichmann very closely and was allowed to live throughout the whole war in Vienna as a repayment for his work, helping Eichmann transport other Jews, some of whom went to Israel or Palestine, and and the vast majority of whom went to first concentration and then death camps. There was another figure who we talked about last class, Stauffer, last session, sorry, who helped Eichmann in Vienna again to organize illegal transports to Palestine with the help of Zionists. And we read about what happened to him in chapter 3, where he went into hiding thinking he was in danger. Because he went into hiding, he was arrested, brought to Auschwitz, and Eichmann went and tried to plead for him to get out. When that couldn't work, he tried to get him a better job. And again, said, I had this human relation with Stauffer. And we talked about last session about how, Arendt just found this grotesquely comic in the worst way. And yet you had to laugh. She thought that he could actually think he was friends with these people. And then the third is Dr. Paul Epstein, who worked with the Jüdische Reichsvereinigung, a coming together of Jews in the Nazi Reich, in the Third Reich, but was appointed by Nazis, and he served as a Jewish elder in Theresienstadt, and was shot in 1944 and helped organize Jews for Eichmann in the camps. And she says there were even other Jews that he could have pointed to that he worked with, who testified at the trial about how he treated them with respect and helped them and things like that. All of this, she says, changed in 1939 as he begins to get promoted up and becomes more important, and then begins to treat the Jews who are working with him much worse and with more anger and more mastery and less compassion. And so there's no doubt a change. Why is this important, right? It's important, she says, because if we want to understand Eichmann, we have to understand that, for the first 7 or 8 years that he's working for the Nazis, what he's saying and doing is something that is widely held in Nazi circles to be a kind of collaboration with Zionists, and that many Zionists, again, in a completely different power situation, forced into this tragedy and emergency, worked with Eichmann and saw him as an honorable person that they could work with to get the best Jews out of Germany or Vienna, and in doing so, created this community. For Arendt, this is a shanda. This is a black mark on those Jews who worked with Eichmann, right? She, and again, it's not in any way a moral equation between those Jews who work with Eichmann and the Nazis. That's not at all the point. She makes it very clear that's not her point. But she does think that what you're seeing here was what she calls, in this chapter and in chapter 3, systemic mendacity. The entire system was based on lies. The entire system was based on distortions of reality. The entire system was based on an idea, a horrific, grotesque, distorted idea that somehow the Jews were the problem, and that the Jews could use this to some degree to leave, to force to convince other Jews. The Zionists could convince other Jews to leave Germany, get out, and start a Jewish state. And that this entire systemic, grotesque, distorted reality, she says, could have been, at least it was the story that Eichmann was telling. No one really believed it, and yet she said there was truth to it, and it's something we should take seriously. I'm going to stop there. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions about this. It's a very, obviously, morally complicated argument she's making. Um, uh, there's a certain, Hans Jonas, who was a very close friend of Hannah Arendt from her time at university, um, was one of the many people who was very upset with Eichmann in Jerusalem. It's this chapter that upset him more than any other, right? It wasn't the banality of evil claim. It wasn't the stuff later in the book we'll read about with the Judenräte, the Jewish leaders. It was this chapter that upset Hans Jonas more than any other chapter. And why? Because Jonas said that in this chapter, even though she doesn't mean it this way, people reading this in the New Yorker will think that she's equating the Nazis and the Zionists. And Jonas was a Zionist. And he says, this chapter was the chapter that most upset him because he thought that it would be interpreted by Americans who don't know the context that Arendt is writing from, as a moral equation of the Zionists and the Nazis. He says, I think I know that you don't believe that, but you didn't make it clear to the readers who don't know the context, And that's why this chapter upset him so much. I think Arendt, clearly knowing the context and knowing that there were debates between assimilationist Jews and Zionist Jews, she's engaged in those debates. She's an anti-Zionist. She's writing this from look, she also was a Zionist at times, but she's writing this from a position of the Zionists went too far morally to work and collaborate with the Nazis in order to promote their political idea. And she thinks that was a moral collapse, and she's critical of them. And so, how do we deal with that? How do you address this idea? Can you be critical of a part of the Jewish response to an emergency and tragic situation, and also say, look, of course, I don't blame the Jews, I blame the Nazis, but we have to understand what was going on, and that helps us understand how someone like Eichmann could do this. Can you say that without blaming the victim, right? That's, I think, a big part of the question. I think Arendt thought she could. Some people obviously disagreed with her, and I'm sure we'll have that conversation today, but I at least want to make it clear what the issues are. All right, so I'm going to stop there and open it to questions. There's two different ways to engage in our discussion here. One is through the chat. Please, in this chat, again, this is one of those questions. This is one of those chapters where people are going to disagree, but they also are going to get angry. You can disagree, but don't get angry at each other, right? These are facts she's talking about. There were Zionists who worked with the Nazis. There were Jews who thought the Zionists collaborated too much with the Nazis. These are facts. These are not anti-Jewish, myths, right? So let's talk about the facts and let's address them. And if we disagree, fine, but stay to an intellectual argument if we can in the chat. And you can also, of course, go down to the reactions button and raise your hand and join the conversation that way. All right. The first person is on the phone from a 626 number. I don't know who you are, but please introduce yourself and you can ask your first question. Are you there? Maybe not. Hello? All right, Hannah Rubenstein, you're next. You got to unmute.
You know what? No, I don't have I'm just going to listen today. I have too. I'm too my thoughts aren't organized enough. Thanks.
Okay, Hannah, thank you. 626, are you back? I don't know who this is, but are you there or not? All right. Stephen.
Hey, Roger.
Hi, Stephen.
So, yeah, I definitely have a lot to say with regard to this chapter. So I want to pick it up on page 61, that super long paragraph.
Hold on
Arendt,
let me find it. One sec. All right, sorry. Yeah,
can you hear me?
go ahead.
Okay, so I felt Arendt slanders the Palestinian Zionist Jews by calling them the enemies of the non-selected German Jews. So I believe this is unfair and an accurate characterization given the complete account by the Kimchi brothers in their book, The Secret Roads, the very book, as you pointed out, Arendt relies so heavily upon in this chapter. Arendt omits important facts and a complete overview because it wouldn't support her derogatory remarks about these Palestinian Zionists. So here I'm saying that Arendt omitted much of the account that the Kimchi brothers provided in the book. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's a pretty thorough account. According to the Kimchis, the emissaries arrived in July 1938 to organize Jewish immigration to Palestine. Arendt wrote in Eichmann on page 61, quote, they were not interested in rescue operations, unquote. And then she goes on to quote the Kimchis that, quote, and this is the Kimchis point, that was not their job, unquote. This was indeed the case initially. However, in the very next paragraph.
Well, now, where are you reading? I don't see where she says they were not involved in a rescue. I'm just trying to find it.
Okay, hold on. That's page 61.
Yeah, I'm on page 61. I just need to find it.
Okay, fair enough.
She says the kimchi she quotes at the bottom of the page, right?
No, this is at the this is at the top of the page. You'll see the reference to the book. These Jews from Palestine spoke a language they had not. Okay, blah,
These
blah,
Jews
blah.
from Palestine spoke a language not totally different from that of Eichmann. So that's not to say that, I mean, all it's saying is.
No, go further. This is an actual quote. They had been sent to Europe by the communal settlements in Palestine, and they were not interested in rescue operations. That's what she's saying.
They had been sent to Europe by the communal settlements in Palestine, and they were not interested in rescue operations. That was not their job. That's a quote from the book, I assume.
And
They
so
wanted to select suitable material. I'm just reading it. Hold on. They just wanted to select suitable material, and their chief enemy prior to the extermination program was not those who made life impossible for Jews in the old countries, Germany or Austria, but those who barred access to the new homeland. That enemy was definitely Britain, not Germany. Okay. I just wanted to read what you were talking about.
Okay, fair enough. And if you keep going on, this is why this is such a difficult paragraph. This is where she does end up further down the Nazi. Situation in which the non-selected majority of Jews inevitably found themselves confronted with two enemies, the Nazi authorities and the Jewish authorities. So in the whole paragraph, the they are these Zionists, Palestinian Zionists.
Yeah.
Right. If you read this paragraph carefully.
Yeah. Okay, no, you're absolutely right.
So, quote, they were not interested in rescue operations, unquote. And then she quotes the Kimchis, which I found because I looked for the book. It is available for anyone who's interested at the internetarchive.org. You can borrow it on the soft copy online for about an hour each time. And so the Kimchis said, quote, that was not their job. So this was indeed the case initially. However, in the very next paragraph of the Kimchi's account, the historians write, quote, they had arrived preoccupied with the needs of the Jews in Palestine. But this outlook and the limited program that had gone with it had to be jettisoned after the night of November 9th, 1938. And we all know that that was Kristallnacht, and that was pretty brutal. 40,000 Jews ended up being arrested shortly thereafter. Shops were destroyed. Jews were barred from trades and craft. and so on and so on. This is when they were forced to wear the star, etc. So 4 months after the emissaries arrived, Kristallnacht changed everything. Arendt does mention Kristallnacht later in the chapter and its impact on German Jews, but she does not address its impact on the Zionist emissaries and how it fundamentally changed their mission. Quote, this is the Kumchis. Kristallnacht affected the Palestinian emissaries. They now had to change their focus. The aim was to save what they could of the Jews in German hands. And so by the end of 1938, the whole outlook of the emissaries had been transformed. They faced a great rescue operation, unquote.
Yeah.
Now, this last point, a great rescue operation, flies in the face of the impression Arendt leaves her readers with in Eichmann. Quote, she said, they were not interested in rescue operations, unquote. It is curious to me she would use the exact same language with the opposite intent.
Yeah, Stephen, can I just ask a question here? And
yes,
my understanding, right? I mean, I think everything you're saying is right, except to me, it simply confirms what Arendt is saying, because she is talking about up to 1937, 38, right? This chapter, right, is an attempt to argue that from 1933 to 1937, 38, right? What Eichmann was doing was part of, was a story, a grotesque, distorted story that the Nazis told, and that many Zionists also embraced or used or were caught up in for various reasons. She's specifically saying it begins to change after 1938, right? After Kristallnacht, the end of 1938 in November. So you're at the end of 38. And so, I mean, everything you're saying, I think, is right, except all I would say is it seems to confirm exactly her point.
what I just said was that, so the emissaries, the specific one that met Eichmann in Vienna at the palace, his name was Moshe Bar Gilead. Now, this is all documented very specifically in David Kimchi's book, the brothers' book. And they only arrived in July 1938. And this guy was basically a farmer from the communes of Palestine. And his superiors all landed in Paris. There were 3 of them. They landed in Paris and they coordinated the operations. This eventually became the core of the Mossad, right? So we have to pay attention to this other account. And the Kimchi brothers, they actually interviewed these people. So this is firsthand account. So these guys, the emissaries, they arrive in middle of 1938, the summer. And 4 months later, there's Kristallnacht. That changed everything. But Arendt doesn't mention that. And she's calling these people the enemies of the Jews. And she also specifically says they weren't there for a rescue operation. She's read the same passages that I've just read. And it says, and she uses the language, they weren't there, they weren't interested in a rescue operation. That's her thought. But this guy is saying they faced a great rescue operation.
After 5 or 6 months, no, like afterwards, right?
4 months.
Change.
4 months.
Okay,
4
but
months
again,
after.
you're missing the point, right? The point is,
No, well, let me make
up until Kristallnacht, there was a general confluence, or as she calls it, chavara. I don't know where she's getting that word from, which means fellowship, right? There was a general fellowship of views that combined, that brought certain Zionists and certain Nazis in some sort of grotesque, distorted union. And she's simply saying, if you understand that, you can understand that Eichmann is not simply lying when he says things like, I tried to save Jews, or I tried to work with things. She's not saying that that's what happened after 1930, November 1938, right? We're getting into the next 2 chapters. It's going to be a very different story.
So Roger, I'm very specific with the relationship between Bar Gilead and Eichmann. This is who Eichmann was meeting. right? And he met him in July 1938. And so the Kimchi brothers point out that this fellow didn't know that Eichmann was the mastermind or contributed to this, pay for exit scheme and robbing the Jews. Can I just make further my point with regard to these passages? So, um, um, so later, if you read this paragraph carefully, so I just said with regard to this language, a great rescue operation. Arendt further comments about selection of Jews for survival. So if you read the paragraph, you'll see that she's intimating that these Zionist Jews were there, and she uses this phrase, which I could not find in the Kimchi book. I don't know where she got it. She puts it in quotes called suitable material, right? Mm-hmm. So Arendt's further comments about selection of Jews for survival and enemies of Jews built upon her premise about the emissaries should be called out as prejudice. If the Kimchi brothers as historians are to be trusted, as Arendt believes so, as she selectively quotes them, then it is incumbent upon all of us, all readers of Arendt, to present the entire context going forward as it reveals itself to us.
Okay.
So
Stephen,
I'm relying on this account of the Kimchis. Roger, I understand this, but if we take into account their complete overview, then and I'm keeping it on, as you asked for, an intellectual argument. Yep. I am using sources that provide a more accurate, detailed description of the relationship that Eichmann had with these individuals, because that's who they were. In fact, I also referenced this other very important document, The Secret Contact Zionism in Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1941, by Klaus Polking. I put the reference in the chat. It's very, very important piece. And she also talks about who Eichmann's contacts were. So before mid-1938, Eichmann had not met these particular Zionists. The one person he was in contact with was a man by the name of Feifel Polks. He was a Haganah officer, and he met Eichmann in 1937. The point I'm trying to make is that I believe Arendt is providing a partial account of Eichmann's relationships based on what she learned from the trial and elsewhere in this book, but she's only selectively choosing facts from this book. I think it's very unfair, and I think it's somewhat slanderous to call these people enemies of the Jews when after Kristallnacht they were there to save the Jews. And there's a big account. This is a wonderful book. I think people should read this in light of what Arendt is saying.
Okay, thank you. So, again, I think everything, all the facts Stephen says, I agree with. I as far as I take it, everything he says supports Arendt's account. Now, that said, right, I tried to make it clear that there is a prejudice here, right? Arendt is clearly I want to say prejudice. There's a judgment here. Whether it's a prejudgment or a thoughtful judgment is an interesting case. So I'll leave it that. But there's a judgment that Arendt makes that the Zionist movement, she thinks, from 1933 to 1938, made a mistaken moral calculation. She thinks they decided to try and work with the Nazis for their own ends, and that to do so, they were willing to make deals and compromises that she thinks shouldn't have been made. Now, that's not to say that they were the same as the Nazis. There's no claim of that in this book, and I think that would be crazy. But it's no, she doesn't. She doesn't. She says that She said, no, she doesn't. She says that the Zionists became the enemies of those Jews who weren't selected, which is highly different than saying they're the same as the Nazis. That said, she is
So
clearly
the only point I'll make here is that she uses the word enemies. And I think that that's, she uses it kind of obliquely,
right.
right?
We heard that. Okay. I know I'm not trying to be, we've had a lot of time on this, right? I just need to, she does say that they're enemies. And, I think on a factual basis, she's clearly right. The Zionists were the enemies of the majority of Jews, in Germany. I mean, I don't think I think that the kimchi book and the other books and the evidence is indisputable on that. Now, the argument you can make is they had no other choice, or they had a Hobson's choice, or it was an impossible choice, and they made a difficult and terrible choice, right, to try and save some and not the others, because they thought that was the best they could do under an awful situation. And I think that's a completely fair and legitimate argument to make. And I don't think Arendt would disagree with it. I think she would say, she would say, I can't judge these people. They made a very difficult choice under a very impossible situation. She's simply trying to understand the moral complexity of the situation at the time. And to say that if you want to understand Eichmann and his guilt at this time, right, not after 1938, but from 1933 to 1938, we could make a defense of Eichmann saying that he was, largely in a world in which not only other Nazis, but many other Jews and especially Zionists who he's working with, saw what they were doing as a common project, as a chavara. Now, we don't have to, she's not saying therefore he's innocent. That's not the claim at all. She's simply saying if we want to understand him, we have to understand that's the world. That's the world of systemic mendacity that he was in. And she thinks it affected the Zionists as well. I think that's indisputable. That doesn't mean the Zionists were wrong. Maybe they were right to make that kind of horrific moral calculation. Right. And she doesn't ever say they were wrong to do it. She just says it was part of the world that Eichmann was in.
Okay, before you let me go, I just want to point to the importance of this discussion in as much as I took in your discussion with Jonathan Graubart, what went wrong with the Zionist project. And I encourage everyone on this Zoom meeting that if they have the time to listen to that, it's available on the internet. I thought it was very, very informative because this history informs the current anti-Zionism that's being discussed in public spheres. I think we really need to take this extremely serious. This is not just about the history of Arendt and her account of Eichmann. This is very topical. Anyway, thanks for your time, Roger.
I agree. And Stephen, let me say, I didn't want to, we've spent, 25 minutes on this, so I'm not trying to cut it short. I think it's very important. I want to say, I'm just going to add to this, not on the Zionist issue, but on a related issue. I've been reading this week a new book called, oh my God, Taking Over, I believe. And it's a fascinating new book. The entire book is a history from July 1932 to January 1933, right? It's the period after the Nazis won 37% of the vote in 1932 to the point where Hitler becomes chancellor in early 1933. And in that 7 or 8 month period, all the different right-wing nationalist parties in Germany think they have Hitler over a barrel, think they can prevent him from becoming chancellor, think they can prevent him, but they don't want to anger him. They don't want to alienate him because they want his voters. for the right-wing nationalist program, and they want that program to win. And so they try and manipulate Hitler, and in the end, of course, they get manipulated and Hitler wins. I think you're seeing a similar thing today in the United States and other places around people trying to prevent, trying to not criticize Trump too much because you want his voters, and yet thinking you can control him or manipulate him, and you're getting manipulated in the end by him. In a similar way, I think there's a story Arendt's telling here, to some degree, about the Zionists, right? That they thought they could use this for a certain advantage, and they got played in the end. That's to some degree how I understand these two things going together. And I think it's a, what we often call this in moral philosophy is the problem of the lesser evil, right? I'm going to work with the Nazis because if I don't, someone else will, and they'll be worse than me. I'm the lesser evil. Or I'm going to work with Trump because if I don't, someone else will. I'm the lesser evil. And I think Arendt, throughout her writing life, is blistering against those who make the argument from the lesser evil. She's like, look, the lesser evil is still evil. I mean, that's a line she uses in the book Responsibility and Judgment. And I think that's what's going on here in chapter 4 is that exploration. It's not to say that the lesser evil is the greater evil. It's not, but it's still in her mind an evil. And that's what she's pointing to. All right, Stephen, I know you want to add one more thing. I'll let you add one more thing and then we're going to have to move on.
Oh,
I'm
no,
sorry. I hope everyone finds this interesting. I find this very interesting. I just don't want to I want to give other people a shot too. So I'm trying to.
I agree. I think I hope in another kind of forum we can continue this discussion. I certainly is worthy of it.
Okay,
Thanks.
great.
Thanks, Roger.
Yep. Thank you, Stephen. Cecilia, you're up next.
Hi. We started off our conversation talking about the distortions of reality that could not be ascribed to, could not really be ascribed to more than the mendacity of an individual. And when I think of mendacity, I think of something that's very active. And when I think of self-deception, which I think is a part of this conversation, I think of something that's much more passive. So could you comment on what the difference is between self-deception and mendacity in the context of this discussion that we're having?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think so. Arendt is answering people here who said, look, Eichmann was just lying, right? And the judges at times seem to think, he's just lying. How can you say that you're a Zionist? Or how can you say that that you saved hundreds of thousands of Jews? These are things he said at the trial, right? And, we will, at the end of this, after we finish this book, we're going to read parts of this book by an independent scholar named Bettina Stungneth, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, in which she argues that Eichmann was just lying and Arendt was duped by him. And so this is an argument that people made in 1961 and 62, and it's an argument that Stungneth made, a few years ago. It's been made. And Arendt is saying, look, I hear the argument, right? You guys think he's just lying. He's just lying to protect himself. And she's saying, maybe, but take seriously for the fact that he wasn't the only one making this argument, right? There were lots of people making this argument. And not only was it a common argument amongst the Nazis, right? And she goes through that, but it was a fairly common argument amongst many Zionists. And if you take that seriously, it may mean that Eichmann, in his own grotesque way, somehow was able to believe that he was actually, a Zionist or that he was actually helping the Zionist movement. I mean, again, you have to understand that she's laughing at this in the sense of how could anyone do this? But she wants to take it seriously to understand what allows someone to do this, right? And is it just he's a liar and he's an inveterate liar and he's an anti-Semite and and he's going to do this? Or is it somehow systems of mendacity emerge that allow people to fool themselves, allow people to live in a fully deceptive way? And that's the argument she's exploring here and running. Stephen points out, and he's right, there were that to some degree, look, a lot of these Zionists, they had no other, what were their options, right? They didn't have a whole lot of options. They could stay in Germany and die, or they should get some people out. They chose to get some people out. Arendt isn't blaming the particular actions of the Zionists. What she's saying, though, is that as people allow themselves to be caught up in such a systemic mendacity, it makes it much more easy for people like Eichmann to keep doing evil because they don't see resistance. And that's the argument that she's making. And so that's why she wants to say he wasn't simply your typical ordinary criminal who's lying to protect himself. He was actually caught up in something bigger. Does that answer your question, Cecilia?
Yeah, you're absolutely addressing it. I think I'd be interested in, now's not the time, but to think more about how that whole system made it so easy for people to deceive themselves. And so that's not for now, so thank you for taking it as far as we can today.
No, it's, I think that's a great question. And that comes back to the thesis of the book, right? That evil is banal, right? It's shallow. It comes from not thinking from the point of view of the other. It comes from, Eichmann being able to think, oh, yeah, of course these Jews want my help. Well, you can't, if you think from the perspective of the Jews and the fact that they're in an emergency situation, that blows up your self-certainty. But he doesn't think that way. And it's this banality that is in her mind what allows this to happen. That's the thesis of the book. And so that's where it goes. Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Stephen.
Hi, thanks, Roger. I was struck when you described the reactions Hans Jonas had to Arendt's work, and it's set off a light bulb. But that is, it seems to me that Arendt, in writing this work, is wearing several hats at once. First, as a journalist, reporting firsthand her observations of the defendant and the proceedings of the trial. And in this chapter, she's working as a historian, looking at sources for which she doesn't have firsthand knowledge, and she's tried to make judgments. And in both of those endeavors, it seems to me her primary aim is and should be arriving at some manner of the truth, granting that there's no absolute truth, and in terms of history, there's no final judgments. There's no issue preclusion, no res judicata. It's done. It's never done, unlike a legal argument. I also note here that she does take great pains also to incorporate a legal perspective in her judgments. And in a sense, she's mounting a much more effective defense of Eichmann than his attorney did there. And last of all, seems to me she's acting as a moral philosopher. She's passing judgments on people's actions and their wisdom or their foolishness, their morality or immorality. And that's very fraught territory, and that too is never subject to a final judgment. But I think in in what Stephen Lowy was talking about. I mean, that seems to me there's a great factual question there. What's a historical record tell us? But in others of these, some of the critiques of her critiquing others, I think that can get a little unfair. But anyway, that's my perception, is she's wearing many hats here, and we have to be aware of which hat she's wearing when she makes a certain argument or conclusion. Differences between facts as events, facts as people's thoughts, beliefs, intentions, and such that go to moral and legal culpability.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that's an excellent point. And, you know, and I think it does come back to Stephen Lowy's question as well, and point. You know, you said she's acting as a journalist, right? And she's reporting. And by the way, a lot of these documents that she's citing were referenced at the trial. So she's you know, talking about things that were actually inserted into the trial record. I don't think the book by the Kimchi brothers, but the reports by Lewin-Hertz and others were into the trial record, I believe. And so, yeah, because they were cited at the trial. And so she's, you know, these are part of the trial. But she's, you know, she's got her own judgments and she's got her own views. And this is where, you know, when Stephen said she's prejudiced, you know, Stephen Lowy, and you said she's got, you know, she's making judgments. I mean, there's no doubt that's true. I didn't go into it fully, but you know, what Hans Jonas, when he criticized her about the Robert Welch, her description of Robert Welch saying that you know, wear it with pride, the yellow star. Well, I mentioned it, but I didn't fully, I'll add to it now. What Robert Welch says, wear it with pride, das gelbe Fleck, right? The yellow blot, or whatever you want to call it. He didn't say star, right? Then 6 years later, the Nazis put a yellow star on people. Jonas says, you know, you may have been completely innocent in just transposing blot and star, but it makes it seem like you know, Welch was saying wear a yellow star, which is not what he said. Okay. You know, there's no doubt that Arendt is, you know, while she did work for the Zionists at time and got arrested working for the Zionists in 1933, she is critical of a main thrust of Zionism, right? Which is that of a kind of Jewish ethno-nationalism, right? And so there's no doubt that she's fighting some battles here in this chapter, with, you know, people that she grew up with and that she was, you know, disagreed with, in the 1920s and 30s in Germany. And so, yeah, there's that element too. So she's a journalist, she's a lawyer, she's a moral philosopher, and she's fighting some personal battles, let's be honest. Right. And so, you know, this is a New Yorker piece. I mean, there's not a New Yorker piece out there that doesn't have, you know, some prejudices in it, right? I mean, that's going to happen. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that there is a way in which, this chapter is kind of, I don't know if I was going to say prosecuting the Zionists. I don't know if that's the right word. It's certainly pointing to some unsavory aspects of German Zionism in the 30s that she finds problematic. And you know, and bringing up the evidence against Zionism, not of course bringing up the evidence for Zionism, right? And that's what Stephen Lowy was talking about, and he's absolutely right. I mean, it's an account. It's within this chapter in which he's saying, all right, you know, how do we understand Eichmann? Well, in order to understand Eichmann, you have to understand the drawbacks of the Zionist movement at the time. You don't have to understand the positive aspects of it. And so it's a one-sided account because that's the context of it. And I think that's right. It's funny, this is a chapter I've read this book so many times, but reading it this time for this group was the first time that I had read it since I had read the Jonas critique of it, because I read the Jonas critique just a few months ago. And going back and reading this chapter now, after having read the Hans Jonas critique of it, made it seem much more one-sided and controversial than I had ever noticed it to be before. Let's put it that way. And doesn't mean I'm 100% convinced by the Jonas critique or by Stephen Lowy's critique, right? I still think factually she's on good ground, but I see it more controversially than I had earlier. And I understand the controversy in it more than I did in the past. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Dina.
Hi, I had a thought I wanted to sort of bring to the group's attention. The first paragraph where she sort of mentions that Dr. Servatius, Eichmann's defense attorney, ignores some relevant facts and sort of may not have mounted the most effective defense. I think it's in part because the chapter 4 is also about Eichmann's failure to remember what actually happened, what he actually did. And she faults him repeatedly for that. Arendt does on page 61 at the bottom, for example, again on page 62, 63, 64. Again and again, she says he had this faulty memory. Had he had a better memory, he may have brought up his quote-unquote collaboration with the Zionists, which Dr. Servatius didn't really use to defend him. And so here's my question: to what extent, and I don't think chapter 4 gives an answer exactly, but to what extent is this faulty memory part and parcel of Eichmann's thoughtlessness and banality? To what extent does the thoughtlessness and banality of evil intersect with memory and the loss of memory, or the failure to preserve memory?
I think it's absolutely related. I mean, so on 62, right? She says that he only remembered things that were part of his career, that had a bearing on his career, right? Yeah. Eichmann's memory functioned only in respect to things that had a direct bearing upon his career, right? And then she says below, and apart from such minor triumphs, Eichmann remembered only moods and the catchphrases he made up to go with them. So, he's someone who only remembers things that contribute to his story in a way and affirm his identity, not anything that that is sort of that is asymptotic to his story. And so I think that's that's part of this inability to see the world from outside of your perspective. It's one-sided. And that's how it always is for him. So I think that's exactly right.
And then just to your point on 64, she says, in other words, the only Jews Eichmann remembered were those who had been completely in his power. So it's only the,
she's saying like the Jews that he liked and that he remembered were the ones who treated him like, thank you, Herr Eichmann, you're so this or that.
Yeah.
Anyone who didn't, they didn't fit his story, so he let them out. To go back to Stephen Lowy's question again, I mean, and I think it was a really good question. That's why I keep coming back to it. Why Arendt's account is sort of one-sided. Why? Because she's trying to tell Eichmann's account, right? She's trying to say, how do we understand someone like Eichmann, right? And we understand it because he remembers those people who asked him for help and treated him like he was a good guy. And that's what he wanted to remember, and that's what he remembers.
If I may, I think it's a little more multifaceted than this. I mean, chapter 4 is certainly about the relationship of Eichmann and the so-called Zionists. But on 58, she takes, at least for a paragraph, she takes post-war Nazi Germany to task and their distortions of reality. And on page 61, which we've spent so much time discussing, I mean, I just emphasize one sentence that we might want to give some attention to as well, which to whether or not she's judging the Zionists morally. I think rather based on the sentence here in the middle of the paragraph that starts with, of course, what she might be judging is their potential naivete, or the fact that it wasn't really foreseeable what the consequences were. She says, of course, they were unaware of the sinister implications of this deal, which still lay in the future. But they too somehow believed that if it was a question of selecting Jews for survival, the Jews should do the selecting themselves. And it was this fundamental error in judgment that eventually led to a situation in which the non-selected majority of Jews inevitably found themselves confronted with two enemies. And then we have that controversial assertion, the Nazi authorities and the Jewish authorities. So, I mean, in that sentence, there is an acknowledgement that this isn't necessarily a willful moral or immoral act, but rather one of unforeseeability.
Absolutely. Yeah, she says, look, they didn't know that there was going to be death camps. Nobody could have, in her mind, nobody could have predicted there was going to be death camps, right? I mean, but there was, nevertheless, she wants to argue, like what you called a fundamental error in judgment, which is what she writes, right? Which is that in their desire to have the Jews do the selecting and to work and to have some say in it, they sought to manipulate, work with, be in fellowship with, Chavara with Eichmann and the Nazis. They thought they could make use of it. And that was a mistake. That was a fundamental error in judgment. Just like I think many people today think they can make use of Trump's, voters. And I think they're trying to work with Trump. And I think they're making a fundamental error in judgment. I think it's a similar move. I think you were right to point to 58. I mentioned it briefly, but we didn't go into it, where she's talking about post-war Germany, right? And also what people thought about people who left Germany during the war. But the point is that this is this systemic mendacity is something that she sees over and over again. And that's what she's really pointing to here in this chapter. So yeah, thank you. Bernie, welcome.
Thank you. I mentioned on our first day that I'm primarily interested in the universal application of Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. And I'm playing a little bit of catch up. I wasn't able to be at the last session. So I read both chapters, just in the last couple of days. And I was just so struck with, I could imagine a historian, 50 years in the future, coming back to try to analyze our contemporary moment. And the contemporary moment being, not quite 9 years ago when Trump descended the golden escalator, and this moment of American history that we've been in since, that people are going to be writing analyses of Trump that are going to echo what we see in these two chapters of Arendt describing Eichmann. And this fascinating phenomenon of the inability to think, and the shortness of memory. And now we've all had so many examples where Trump will begin a sentence saying one thing and he won't even finish the sentence before he's contradicting himself. You can't even remember what he was saying a few seconds earlier, let alone days or months ago. And that my own scholarly expertise is analyzing the American evangelical mind as it applies to environmental issues. And I actually constantly amazed at my research subjects and the lack of thought that goes into the defense of their own ideas. And so that's one of the things that I find most valuable, that I, as a non-Jew, not especially involved in these debates about did Arendt get Eichmann right or not, but her attempt to get Eichmann right provides us so many tools of analysis in the present moment. That's what I wanted to mention today.
That's a great point, Barry, and I really thank you for it. I mean, I think it's not wrong for us to be caught up in the specifics of did she get this right? I mean, in the end, though, this is not a historical book, right? I mean, the Kimchis wrote a book of history, right? And Stephen's right. Their book of history is, like all books of history, filled with facts and complicated, and Arendt takes, I don't know how long the Kimchi book is, Stephen, you might know, but she takes probably a 200 or 300 page book and quotes 3 or 4 sentences from it, and obviously does so to make a point, right? She's trying to make her point, and her point is not the Kimchi's point, right? I mean, which is she's trying to say something about Eichmann. She's trying to say something about the way, about how Eichmann is not someone who is necessarily lying so much as he is part of a system of mendacity, and that in order to be part of a system of mendacity, there have to be others who are also part of that system of mendacity. And in this case, there were people both on the Nazis and on the Jewish side. And so that's the argument she's making. And so, yeah, it's not a book of history. It's an argument. And I think it's an argument that has a lot of purchase today. And I tried to bring that out in a number of ways, and Bernie's adding to that. So I think it's really smart. Thank you. George.
Okay, well, I'd just like to enlarge the geography of this discussion a little bit. I think it's interesting about the Zionists and the German army and the German Jews, but there were some Jews in Poland at the time. And also the interesting thing is that the Polish army, whose anti-Semitism was secondary to none, was training Irgun fighters in the 1930s because they wanted to get the Jews in Poland out to Palestine. So this was nothing unusual as far as the Palestinian Jews and making agreements with various enemies. Whether that happened to be a mistake in the long run is something to argue, but it was certainly nothing that Hannah Arendt just all of a sudden came up with, and it was only unique to Germany. It was in Poland. It was obvious. I mean, they were training the Irgun fighters.
I think that's a good point. Thank you, George. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I should say, remember, this is simply the first of 3 chapters, right? Where she's going to talk about the different solutions that the Nazis had to the Jewish problem, right? This is the first solution. And it's the solution that we often forget because we read this looking back from the perspective of knowing what the third solution was. These are, I come across this argument a lot when I talk to people about Martin Heidegger, who I also teach quite often, right? And people say, oh, he was a Nazi. And that's true. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933. He was a Nazi for about, and he was a Nazi official for I think about 8 months or 9 months, and then he was fired / resigned, but he kept his party membership, right? But this is not to defend Heidegger. There's a lot to talk about. It's a complicated issue. We're not going to get into it, but again, in 1933, the Nazi party that Heidegger was not an exterminationist party, right? It was anti-Semitic. It was about expelling the Jews. These are bad things, but it wasn't exterminationist. And I think too many times when I have these conversations with people, they think, oh, Heidegger wanted to kill all the Jews. It was clearly the case that part of the Nazi program was not one that he embraced in any way. And in fact, he opposed it. But we do have to realize these things happen in stages. And, many people, including many Jews, thought they could work with the Nazis at this time. And that's what Arendt is here forcing us to confront. That's an important point. All right, we are out of time. I'm going. Hold on. There's one more question. We got 2 minutes. Okay, I'll let you go. John, you're up. You got 2 minutes.
Okay. The Jewish problem. The Germans and the Europeans in general, like the Dreyfus case in France, had a Jewish problem. That is, we understand that. They didn't want the Jews in their midst for various reasons, but the Jews themselves had a Jewish problem. They were not comfortable, not all of them are comfortable with the assimilationist model. So the question is, to what degree is the Jewish problem a problem for Jews and a problem for Germans?
In 10 seconds or less. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And it's a question we don't often talk about, right? Because we don't want to, as Jews, we don't want to think there's a Jewish problem. But yes, Arendt was both suspicious of the assimilationists, right? She was not an assimilationist. And she was worried that the assimilationist was a kind of death of Jewry and was against plurality. But she was also suspicious of the Zionists, who she thought were too much caught up in the national question. So where her position is a complicated one. But it's certainly neither on the assimilationist side nor on the Zionist side. But she does help us remember these debates that were obviously central to the time and are coming back in many ways today. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you all very much. We don't meet next week. I'm sorry we've had such a 2 weeks on, week off thing. It's just the Arendt Center has been very busy and we're doing a lot of stuff. We have an amazing event next Friday at Bard, where in honor of my recently deceased colleague, we have a recitation award where students memorize poems and then recite them. And we have a series of judges who will award them. And it's our second annual recitation award, Bill Mullen Recitation Award, and that happens next Friday. So I won't be able to run the reading group, but we'll be back in 2 weeks and we'll read the second chapter in this section called The Second Solution, Concentration. Please enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. If you do know the podcast and listen to the podcast and you're open to it, please do leave a comment about it. The podcast is getting a lot of traction, and the more comments and reviews we get, the better. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Bye-bye.